All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky. I am your host for tonight's exciting program on information science, intelligent design, and incredible evidence for God. On Standing for Truth, we uphold the truth of biblical creation. It is a privilege to have Fred Williams from Real Science Radio with me to assist in accomplishing this valuable mission. If you are open-minded and believe that science supports evolution and naturalistic origins, this program might just change your mind. Fred, thank you so much for giving us your time for tonight's important program. How are you doing tonight, brother?
I'm doing great, Donnie, and I really appreciate you having me on your channel.
Well, I appreciate you in light of how busy you are, Fred, in giving us your time for this. I'm really looking forward to your presentation and our discussion. Before we get into your presentation, which I'm looking forward to, I just want to give you a formal introduction for anybody who might be unfamiliar with who you are. Fred Williams has a BS in electrical engineering from Missouri S&T. He currently works as a senior firmware engineer for Micron Technology, serving as technical lead for the NAND modeling and later the error mitigation teams. He was the software architect for numerous high-profile projects, including IBM's Data Center Critical Sysplex Timer and McData's SCON repeater. He was the firmware manager and lead engineer for Trimble's telematics division that developed Caterpillar's first high-precision GPS device for heavy highway vehicles. He also helped Ceridian BCT develop the first adult stem cell chamber. Fred is currently the co-host with Doug McBurney on the popular Real Science radio program that airs on the 50K watt blowtorch of the Rockies, AM 670 KLTT in Denver. Fred, again, I appreciate you being here. And for anybody in the audience that wants to see more from you, I do have the relevant links in the description box for people to check out. Fred, let's hand it over to you for an important presentation here. The floor is yours.
All righty. Thank you, Donnie. So I've given this talk several times over the years. I've got quite a few new slides tonight in case you've seen those. So the talk is going to be on the quantum imprint, how information topples evolution. So as Donnie mentioned, we've been on the radio in Denver, Colorado. It's been about 18 years now. And we've also started our YouTube channel. We started that about 1.5 years ago. And so that's been a lot of fun. Our producer told us that we needed to go on YouTube. And I told him, well, I have the perfect face for radio. But he insisted. And so here we are. We're now on YouTube. And now I have the pleasure of being on Standing for Truth, which is just is really one of my favorite channels for creation. Okay, so I'm going to dive right in and just start talking briefly about Google's Sycamore processor. And you know, IBM Condor, they have an over 1,000 quantum qubit processor. So this particular one here, it contains 53 superconducting qubits, and it achieved quantum supremacy by solving a problem in 200 seconds that would take 10,000 years on your typical top-end supercomputer. And it proved that quantum computers can perform tasks infeasible for classical computers. So I wanted to start with this because when you consider the classical materialist view, where computation equals physical matter moving through space, you know, electrons and wires. Well, quantum processors, they manipulate these qubits, which exist in superpositions, states that can be explained by particles in fixed positions. And so we know that information isn't just matter and energy, and this is echoing Norbert Wiener and the famous physicist John Wheeler. In fact, they coined it from bit, that the universe may be built from information itself. So he was, as I mentioned, John Wheeler, famous physicist, he actually coined the term black hole. And he broke his career into 3 phases. First, everything is particles. Then second, everything is field. In the latter half of his career, he said that everything is information. And then there's Norbert Weiner. He is a professor of mathematics at MIT, and he was the founder of cybernetics. He said information is information, not matter or energy, because you get a lot of secular scientists and people that are, have a worldview against creation, that they try to deny information. They say everything is material, everything is just matter and energy. So in previous talks that you can find on the internet, I spend probably at least 15 to 20 minutes describing what information is. I'm not going to do that in this particular talk. So just to summarize, information is, there's 2 kinds of information. It's the most important one that evolutionists like to use, and then it's my default position because I can talk on their terms, is Shannon information, the reduction of uncertainty. And the pictures that you see on the slide here, the top 2, the ones in the top row, that is actual information. It's conveying information to the receiver. The bottom pictures are not information. And if you'd like to find out why, I'm just going to refer you to the other videos I've done on this. But I think you'll get the overall concept of information. So from Webster's, it's the communication or reception of knowledge or intelligence. And Wikipedia describes the Shannon version, which I accept also as information is the resolution of uncertainty. Okay, so this is a popular slide that you can find on the internet where they try to promote that the universe is just matter and energy. And of course, we know that if you think about the dark energy and dark matter, those are just fudge factors to account for, to try to account for gravity and a supposed expanding universe. Okay, so how much does information weigh? Because they'll try to claim that information is matter. In fact, this guy back in 2022, he proposed that digital data could be altering Earth's mass just a tiny bit, because again, he believes that mass or information has mass. So this is what the article said. According to calculations made a few years ago by University of Portsmouth physicist Melvin Vopson, this literal mass of visual imagery, along with 500 million tweets, countless texts, billions of WhatsApp messages, and every other bit and byte of information we've created, could be making our planet a touch heavier. In fact, in 350 years, some experts predict the weight of our digital bits could outweigh all the atoms on the Earth. So this kind of thing, I like to bring up my baloney detector, and we're going to talk about why. Okay, so is information physical, as Vopson claims, and does it have mass? So I'm going to use an example of NAND memory, and this is something we work with at Micron, so I'm very familiar with how this works, very intimately involved in it. So just real quickly, NAND flash, it stores data in memory cells using a floating gate transistors. And basically you have a 0 bit when electrons are trapped in the floating gate, and 1 when it has no trapped electrons. And so the erase operation, erasing a single bit means removing the trapped electrons from the floating gate to reset it to a 1. And it's done using a process called Fowler-Nordheim tunneling, and it applies a certain voltage. So that's where he's going to go with this Vopson, where he's trying to show that information has mass. So Landier proposed that erasing 1 bit of information requires a minimum amount of energy. And, and that is true for our NAND. I mean, we all, obviously have to apply energy to erase bits. So what Vopson did is he took Landier's principle and he took Einstein's mass energy equivalents, he merged them together to come up with an equation where he says he shows that information has mass. But this is a sleight of hand. So Landier's principle speaks to the energy needed to process or erase information. It's not the intrinsic mass of the information stored. By applying E equals mc squared directly to the erasure energy, Vopson implies that the stored information carries mass, even though Landier's principle doesn't actually claim this. And it's like saying if moving a book requires energy, then the information in the book must have mass. This confuses the energy involved in the action with the inherent properties of the object. There are many physicists who are secular that realize that what he's claiming really just doesn't hold water, but it did get some press. And, obviously the secular atheists who are complete materialists are going to, jump right onto it. Interestingly, by the way, Bobson does claim to be a Christian, but he caters to the secular worldview, which is interesting. If he's a believer, why does he try to promote materialism? Anyway, so the same guy, he claimed that there is no dark matter because he says all the dark matter is actually information. So in that regard, he's kind of saying, well, there's information in the universe. And so in making the claim in this way, he's saying that information is physical. He wants to, again, cater to the secular worldview. But again, we take out our baloney detector. It just doesn't work. Information does not have mass. It's not physical. And, at Real Science Radio, we like to make predictions. And we predict that if you ever could make measurements, for example, measure a data lab, maybe a huge data center, and see if it actually changes mass, if it increases in mass when you add information. We know that they're ever able to do that, they'll show that information does not have mass. Okay, so I wanted to talk about quantum entanglement and its relationship to the information theory, information science. It's a really interesting topic. So if you consider this example of heads and tails and picture that they're somehow entangled with each other. So if you flip them in two separate rooms, even miles apart, when you check one coin and see heads, the other coin instantly will be tails every single time. And here's the twist. The coins didn't decide on heads or tails until you looked at one of them, until you observed it. So and the result of the second coin is still the perfect opposite instantaneously. So I use this example in an article I wrote for Foundation's newsletter, which is a newsletter for Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship. And Dr. Don DeYoung, he used to be the president of Creation Research Society. He's a physicist. He actually referenced my articles in one of his. And in this case, I use a politician example. Basically, you start with two objects, say object A and object B. Each of these objects have two possible states, either red or blue. Perhaps the object is like a wishy-washy politician who, depending on the direction of the wind or which state he is campaigning in, he's either a Democrat or Republican. Through a subatomic interaction, object A becomes entangled with object B. So what this entanglement does is link the objects as a system. So imagine the two politicians, object A and object B, must now, in their entangled state, always be diametrically opposed on all issues. Men can play should play women's sports. No, the other view is going to be no, they shouldn't, etc. So they become entangled and they're guaranteed to always have the opposite. And what's interesting about quantum entanglement, no matter how far you separate the two entangled particles throughout the universe, it doesn't matter how far, they're still entangled. They still have some strange connection with each other. In fact, Einstein called it spooky at a distance. And Einstein was very troubled by this. And so he proposed a theory. He didn't want this idea to be true because it contradicted the thing that made him famous, special relativity. So he came up with this idea of hidden variables at the time that they entangled with each other so that they knew about each other when they were separated apart. And he published this idea in 1935. And so we have to consider that special relativity is what made Einstein famous. He's been on Time magazine, he's been Time Man of the Year several times. And, when you consider this, that Einstein, he's loved by the left. And doesn't the Bible say the wisdom of the world is foolishness to God? And that comes from 1 Corinthians 3:19. So the there were three scientists who won the Physics Nobel Prize in 2022, and they proved Einstein wrong about hidden variables. And here's the three physicists who won this. And they all did work over this, over the several decades of time, and eventually proved that Einstein was wrong, that quantum entanglement is a real phenomenon. And one of them, John Clauser, said he was very sad to see that my own experiment had proved Einstein wrong. And he even mentioned about how he was warned that he could get a lot of opposition to his viewpoint, which he did have. He's like, man, you're kind of threatening your career. But over time, the evidence kept piling in, and eventually these three guys won the Nobel Prize for it. So here's an article from Nature, 2008, where it says entanglement shows that in quantum mechanics, at least, some things transcend space-time. And why is that important? Because one of the tenets of special relativity is that light cannot travel, or information cannot travel faster than the speed of light. And so this also implies that there's non-locality, which goes against special relativity. And just this quote from Big Think, that the basis of the universe may not be energy or matter, but information. So if you apply Shannon information to this particular phenomenon, it's interesting because evolutionists, as I mentioned earlier, they prefer the definition of information as provided by Shannon. In fact, they'll make fun of other complex specified information, coined by other creationists, such as Stephen Meyer, and which I think is a decent definition. There's nothing wrong with it. And any attempts made by Werner Gett and others. Well, information theory, which I'm real familiar with because I've actually applied it at my work. If you actually use Shannon information, at least one bit is transferred. So it's ironic that Shannon information shows that there is information in a quantum entanglement of at least one bit. So here's a physicist who recently said this: quantum entanglement allows you to send information faster than light, which upset Einstein. But Einstein has the last laugh. The information you send on quantum entanglement is random, useless information. So Einstein still has the last laugh. So this is pretty insulting to Einstein, as if he wouldn't have thought of this. So again, there's no way that Einstein, if he would have made the same statement, but he didn't, because he realized that there was a problem here. And again, Shannon theory, which came into play in the late 1930s, if you just apply his principles, there is information that's transmitted. So the idea that entanglement doesn't allow for useful or faster than light communication was introduced after Einstein, mainly by physicists trying to reconcile entanglement with special relativity. Okay, here's some more quotes from secular scientists. This is from Scientific American. This non-local effect is not merely counterintuitive. It presents a serious problem to Einstein's special theory of relativity. Now, I'm bringing this into the talk. It's not, germane to information science in particular, but I do want the audience to know that there are arguments that exist against special relativity. Here's another quote from Physics Today. Does quantum entanglement violate relativity? Here's what the quote says: how entanglement works without violating relativity's limit on the speed of information transfer is still not understood. So he's being candid and pretty much refutes the earlier quote from the physicist who's trying to explain it away. Okay, let's talk about another phenomenon that we're familiar with at Micron. It's called quantum tunneling. And this is an example where electrons can occasionally tunnel through the insulated oxide layer on these NAND gates via quantum tunneling, and it allows them to enter or exit the floating gate. So this can actually cause disturbance or noise into determining whether or not there's a 0 or 1 stored in this. And so we've had to come up with error correction mechanisms. And, quantum tunneling isn't the only thing that causes deterioration. There's obviously other things, cosmic rays. There's just the deterioration of the NAND part in general. But it is a problem that we have to deal with. Well, what's interesting about this, an engineer at Texas Instruments back in 1962, he actually came up with a way to measure it, and he found that this tunneling did break the speed of light. And even recently from Quantum Magazine, quantum tunnels show how particles can break the speed of light. And this article said tunneling seems to be incurably, robustly superluminal, which means faster than the speed of light. Okay, so quantum information, so by tying information to the speed of light, Einstein effectively relegated information within the confines of matter and energy per his famous equation E equals mc squared. So what quantum mechanics and spooky at a distance proves is that information transcends E equals mc squared. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the double slit experiment, which I just find completely fascinating. And what it does is it proved that light is both has dual properties. It can be both a particle or a wave. And what's interesting, when you run the light through these two slits, you get an interference pattern. So it's like, oh, okay, the light must be a wave. It's proves that it's a wave. But if you have an observer at the slit, if you actually look at it, it looks like an 11 when it goes through the two slits, or in this case, just a straight line. So if that's the case where observing it, it becomes a particle. So the way it's explained is that it collapses when you observe the wave function. It collapses and forces the particle to behave like a classical particle. So merely observing changes the behavior. So I want to tie that back in when I started the presentation with Google's quantum chip and IBM's quantum chip. So qubits aren't physical bits. They represent non-material information. Measurement depends on observers, not just matter. Entanglement defies space. Reality may be non-local. Probabilistic behavior resists strict determinism, and mind or conscious might be foundational. So this is really, I mean, we've had a lot of things that's been the death of materialism, but if this isn't a huge spike into its coffin, quantum entanglement in this double slit experiment, it's a serious blow. It demonstrates that conscious observation directly impacts physical systems, and it challenges the foundation of materialism by showing that the mind is not a byproduct of matter, but a participant in reality itself. And that's why John Wheeler said everything is information. So if we look at Hebrews 11, verse 3, by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Okay, so I'd like to go through some real world examples of information that have been my favorites over the years. In fact, this particular one, the golden plover, I saw a talk by Dr. Werner Gitt from Germany. He was visiting the United States, and he came and gave a talk to our local creation group. And he had slides of this, and I thought it was really fantastic. I ended up having my brother do some new slides, and I actually sent these to Werner. I don't know if he ever used them, but anyway, so the golden plover, it migrates from Alaska to Hawaii, and it's a 2,500 mile trip. The flight takes 88 hours, which is 3 days and 4 nights. And so the plover puts on an additional 50% of weight, which is about 70 grams before embarking. And it converts 0.6% of body weight per flight hour into motion and heat. So if you consider helicopters, the most advanced helicopters, their consumption rate is 4% per hour, and a jet just 12%. This is 0.6%. It's amazing how efficient this is. So here's the problem, though. At this rate, all fuel, body fat, would have exhausted 500 miles short of Hawaii. And so why don't the birds just plunk into the ocean? Well, my brother has a sense of humor. He did this image here of birds, they got there by plane. How they really got there is there's a reason why birds fly in a V formation. And it's interesting that the weaker birds are allowed to fly towards the back, and the stronger birds tend to fly towards the front of the V formation. But when they do this, they can go 500 miles past Hawaii, more than enough time. And so this is information. There's no way these birds would know to do this. And, they hatch their eggs and then they leave Alaska. So they're young. It's not like they hang around and teach their young how to do this. So the information had to be already present in their brains before they do this. There's no way that this could have evolved. Okay, so I like this one. So DNA, they've discovered in the last 10 to 20 years, it encrypts multiple codes. We always thought that DNA, when you transcribe it and build a protein, it built just one protein. Well, as it turns out, if you read the DNA backwards or even diagonally, it creates even other functions. So here's the case where the scientist, this one guy talks about, he discovers a double meaning in the genetic code. And I want to kind of give you an example. So say that you've got the one sequence reading forward says build an antibody to fight infection, and then add more cold when it's outside is the other pattern or other instruction when you read it the other direction. And so these are overlaying each other. So what happens if you mutate one spot on that DNA helix? Well, you're corrupting both. And so here you can see the destruction that it could do, that it totally messes both instructions up. And so this particular scientist said this: the fact that the genetic code can simultaneously write two kinds of information means that many DNA changes that appear to alter protein sequences may actually cause disease by disrupting gene control programs or even both mechanisms simultaneously. So it turns out they found that it can encrypt up to 12 different directions. I mean, who knows? It's probably even more than that. So a rare beneficial mutation has to not break functionality of the other 11 codes. So how can that possibly be? So here's what Dr. Marcus Eberlein, PhD, and he's the founder of the Thomson Mass Spectrometry Laboratory. He's a highly regarded scientist from Brazil. He said this: as a biochemist, I became skeptical about Darwinism when I was confronted with the extreme intricacy of the genetic code and its many most intelligent strategies to code, decode, and protect its information. Okay, here's another example I like. So Charles Darwin offered this test for his theory. If it could be proved that any part of the structure of any one species had been formed for the exclusive good of another species, it would annihilate my theory, for such could not have been produced through natural selection. And we've got many examples of symbiosis in nature. You've got the cleaner fish and the shark generally eats most fish, but he doesn't eat this one. He lets it go in and clean its teeth. And then the fish itself gets advantage of food particles from the shark. So they have this symbiotic relationship. But if evolution is true, how many times did that not work before the shark decided to let that fish, clean his teeth? I've actually got a saltwater aquarium, and I've got an anemone and clownfish, and the clownfish will hang out in the anemone, and the anemone protects them because no other fish can get near it because it stings when they touch it. And so the clownfish will actually, when I feed the tank, it'll grab food and take it to the anemone. It's pretty cool. Okay, so they've also recently discovered that trees communicate and nourish each other and warn each other. So this scientist discovered that trees send warning signals about environmental change, search for kin, and transfer their nutrients to neighboring plants before they die. Here's Dr. Lee Spetner. He wrote a book many years ago. It was one of my favorite books, Not by Chance. And he was a physicist from MIT. He said this: in all the reading I've done in the life sciences literature, I've never found a mutation that added information. The neo-Darwinian theory says not only that such mutations must occur, they must also be probable enough for a long sequence of them to lead to macroevolution. So if you consider that Dr. Jerry Bergman, he actually did a research on the literature, searching the internet. And when he looked for a mutation, he ended up with over 400,000 hits. And out of those, only 186 were, quote, beneficial. And when he looked at the 186 and he examined them closely, he found that they actually resulted in some loss of function. So it was actually a loss of information. Often evolutionists, they will try to claim that a beneficial mutation is beneficial, and they won't tell you of the harmful effects, or they'll just assume it's okay. I've had PhD scientists tell me that cancer is evolution. Okay, so for those who haven't seen this, I don't know if this will play. We'll give it a shot. I think it might. So he couldn't even think of one. And if in that particular field, that went on even longer. Okay.
Fred, I'm not sure if the question played. Richard Dawkins was in silence because he had no answer. So,
oh, okay. Did you hear the first part?
I don't think his question came through the host that was asking Richard Dawkins.
Okay, so basically on that clip, he just asked him if he could think of a single example of a mutation at the genetic level that allowed an increase in information, and that was Dawkins' reaction. He just sat there dumbfounded. So, do you want me to try to replay it, or just go on?
No, I think that's good, Fred. You
perfect.
summarized it well.
Okay. So here's one that evolutionists love, and it's a sickle cell trait. So here's from this particular article on bigthink.com. So, and it just shows how evolutionists are desperate for information adding mutation in nature. So they get all excited when they think they found one. So here's a quote: people with just one copy of this gene are 29% less likely to get malaria, while people with two copies enjoy a 93% reduction in risk. And this gene variant causes, at worst, a mild anemia, nowhere near as debilitating as sickle cell disease. So they try to claim, well, hey, if you got this one mutation, it makes you less likely to get malaria, but yet you definitely have a disease. And trust me, you can ask anybody who's got sickle cell trait, would they rather not have that sickle cell trait, or would they rather have it and just live in a malaria affected environment? I'd say they'd probably say, hey, get me out of this malaria infected environment, get me a U-Haul. I was at this particular NFL football game. It's when the Steelers played the Broncos in Mile High Stadium in a playoff game, and it was the famous Tebow game. And this particular Steelers player, his name is Ryan Clark. So he had severe pain in his left side, so he had to sit out, and it was because of sickle cell disease, which was worse they were worried to be worse at elevation. So trust me, this guy would rather not have that disease, but yet evolutionists want to call this a beneficial mutation. Okay, then another one they got all excited about. I don't know how many times I heard about this through the years, but they claimed that nylon-eating bacteria was an example of information added to the genome in nature. So here's the story. In 1975, Japanese researchers found some bacteria living in a pond next to a nylon-producing plant that could digest nylon. Nylon wasn't invented until 1935, so there would be no reason whatsoever for bacterium to be able to digest nylon before it was invented. Thus, in a mere 40 years, a new gene had evolved, allowing the bacteria to digest something that they otherwise could not digest. And so, by the way, nylon producing plant, that's like a big, manufacturing plant. Okay, so here's what science actually revealed: that this particular bacteria does not digest nylon. They digest broken down bits of nylon molecules, and the ability to digest nylon waste products is incredibly common in bacteria and other organisms from a diverse set of environments. And this comes from Dr. John Sanford and also Sal Cordova. So their analysis indicate that nylonase genes are abundant, come in many diverse forms, are found in a great number of organisms, and these organisms are found within a great number of natural environments. So it totally shot a hole in that particular nylon-eating bacteria claim. Okay, another favorite one is, gene duplication. That's adding information. That provides the mechanism. Man, if we can duplicate a gene and then mutate it, that's a way to add information to the genome. So this discovery led geneticist Susumu Ono to speculate that the gene for one of the enzymes had come about from the combination of gene duplication. So this is in regard to the nylon-eating bacteria. So I'll skip to the part, a 2007 paper suggested that, in fact, no friendship mutation was involved in the evolution of this particular hydrolase. However, many other genes have been discovered which did evolve by gene duplication followed by a frame shift mutation. So later papers said, well, this whole claim about nylon-eating bacteria, even the secular scientist says, well, no, this wasn't a gene duplication. But they still promoted gene duplication as a way for evolution to occur. So they get all excited and they think they have another one. But the problem is gene duplication. If you look, and you can do your own research on this, just do a search for gene duplication and look what you end up coming up with. All kinds of things like pancreatic cancer. Gene duplication explains tumor aggressiveness. Roles in cancer. Look at all these different gene duplications in this list here of the different diseases and cancers that it causes. And so they also will try to claim that, gene duplication gives you twice the information, which is shocking to me that they actually believe that. So this is a product here, just to give a kind of a real world example. We developed this product at McData, and we had 2 redundant CPUs, and it was more for stability, redundancy. And each software card, each motherboard on those different cards, main processor boards, they had the exact same information in them. There was just a small piece that was switching logic. So when one board went out of service, it would just switch to the other one. And so even following Shannon information, it just does not have extra information. Same thing with RAID devices. If anyone's familiar with RAID, it doesn't store twice the information. It merely protects the information that it currently stores. And it reduces that noise that could lessen the information stored. It doesn't store twice the information. Okay. This is a report from when Dr. Francis Collins was still the head of the NIH. He said that there was analysis that showed that gene duplication, when they looked at what they thought were duplicated genes, how they split the work, well, that has all the earmarkings of design. And it reminded me of, for example, of the Cisplex timer that we did for IBM. And basically you had two machines that could be in different parts of the lab and at pretty decent distances, but they would actually keep slightly more accurate time using a phase lock loop between 4 different clocks. And if one of the Cisplex timers went down, then the other one could take over. It'd be slightly less accurate, but still very accurate. And this was a very critical component. In fact, it was rated their #1 critical component to work in their database centers. And so that's why we had to go to a lot of work to build this dual system, which is an example of, as an analogy to gene duplication. Both of them had incredibly important roles to play. So it points to design. So here's another one. So this picture has creationists terrified, and no wonder. It's the most powerful evidence for evolution that you can imagine. So what are they talking about here? Sorry, guys. Looks like the font on the translation that probably said baloney. I don't know what that said, but okay. So here's the claim. It's the chromosome 2 fusion. And I'm sure that many of you who are well familiar with creation versus evolution arguments, this is one of their most popular arguments that they like to use. So they claim that all great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes, and that 2 fused together in the past arrive at 23 pairs on humans. And so, they were selectively searching for evidence, and what they found was the correspondence of chromosome 2 to 2 ape chromosomes, near identical DNA sequences. That was their claim. And they claimed the presence of a vestigial centromere and the presence of a vestigial telomeres. So let me show you what we're talking about. So here's the chromosome 2 for the humans, and from the apes, 2 chromosomes come in and fuse, allegedly. And so then they said, oh, look, we're looking at the genome, you've got these centromeres, and you have also got these telomeres. What are they doing there? That looks like a fusion from chimp, this chimp. Okay, so Jeffrey Tompkins, PhD at ICR, he did a lot of research on this, and this is what he found. When he looked at this actual sequence, and now that we have ENCODE and we can actually look at the data instead of, use less data and speculate, he found that this was a gene that was fully functional, the centromere. Fully functional gene. So it could not be a fusion. And it turns out it's basically a binding switch. And I want to show you what he said. So functional genes do not arise by mythical fusing of telomeres. The alleged fusion site is not a degenerate fusion sequence, but is and since creation has been a functional feature in an important gene. And I liked a science report that came out that's related to Dr. Thomas D. Schneider's work. So he also works at NIH for the National Cancer Institute. I used to correspond with him a fair amount back in the day because he had a good understanding of information theory, and he even wrote papers and would spend time on the internet refuting his own evolutionists who claimed that information was the same thing as uncertainty, that information was randomness. And he was really good. He was really useful for us in disproving that. Well, he did work where he used information theory to find binding sites. And by the way, here's one of his pages where he goes through why information is not entropy. It's not uncertainty. You can learn more about this if you were to find my other talks on information where I get into more what information is. Anyways, NIH, not that long ago, they discovered that it would take 100 million years to change a binding site. And so, let's consider that they claim we evolved from a chimp-like ancestor 5 million years ago. So if they're going to use this chromosome 2 fusion, it would take 100 million years just for that binding site to form. So I'd love to at some point get a hold of Dr. Snyder. I've actually tried and he's not replying, but I might try again and just get his opinion on this. He's a committed atheist, evolutionist, Marxist, and I'm not sure his worldview would change, but it's just amazing how so much evidence has come in, just piling in against the worldview of chimp and humans sharing common ancestry. Okay, so another argument that they like to make is that mistakes argue for evolution, and this is a pseudogene argument. So this is fake news, and I'm going to show you why. So first, here's an analogy from atheist Kenneth Miller. He said this: I ran your papers through a program that looks for unusual matching strings. You guys misspelled the same 6 words in the same 6 ways. And when you have matching mistakes, there's no other explanation other than a common ancestor for the paper. Okay, well, that's true. So he tries to apply that analogy to these broken pseudogenes. But the problem here is that he's assuming that these are non-functional. And so what he does is he says, oh, they both the ape and the human has the same broken pseudogene, so it must have a common ancestor, just like his analogy for the plagiarism on the paper. Okay, so again, the question is, are pseudogenes junk or are they functional DNA? Because if they're functional DNA, it totally destroys their argument. They can't use it anymore. Well, that's exactly what we're finding. More and more, we're finding that pseudogenes actually have a function. And it totally refutes their argument. It totally cuts the legs out from underneath it. Pseudogenes that have been suitably investigated often exhibit functional roles. Those that have been suitably investigated totally refutes their argument. Okay, and just consider if there was such a thing as a beneficial mutation. I kind of want to try to give you a picture what that would be like. So Josh Allen recently signed a $330 million a year contract for the Buffalo Bills. So the impact of a beneficial mutation on the genome would be akin to taking a $10 bill from this huge contract of his. It would be indiscernible. And so what I'm showing here is genetic load and mutations. And what happens, and we're going to talk about genetic loads, and this is a huge, overwhelming math problem for evolution. It just destroys it. So if you take a mutation rate, and let's say it's 9 per person, the unaffected offspring that do not get the mutation, the harmful mutation, or even slightly harmful, is 2 to the e to the 9th power. It's a Poisson distribution. So the required offspring would be 16,000. And so ENCODE has made this even worse. This is a slide I got from Sal Cordova. And so if you look at the number of new slightly harmful or deleterious mutations per individual per generation, if you've looked at how those have actually grown over time based on more information, and if you see down here from ENCODE, if it's 82, you would need 10 to the 35th power required offspring per female 10 to the 35th power. Just realize that there's 10 to the 80th power molecules in the entire universe. That's a pretty active parents producing that many offspring. So in a debate, evolutionist Dr. Dan Grauer, he has a degree in molecular biology. He argued that if most of the human genome is functional, each human female needed to make 10 to the 35th children to prevent human genomic degeneration. So he admits that that's true, that the math is correct. But because of his worldview, he concluded that therefore the human genome must be about 90% junk. Well, is the genome 90% junk? Well, I'm sure many of you have heard that, junk DNA has pretty much been refuted. Even Dr. Collins who recently retired from NIH, Francis Collins, he walked this back. He claimed it was his hubris that made him support junk DNA. And now he believes that he doesn't know of any DNA that's junk. And this is from the Department of Biomedical Informatics at the University of Colorado. This is just in 2024. This scientist admits that there is no such thing as junk DNA. They're no longer useless. He said this: in modern, more enlightened times, we realize that while genes, the protein coding units of the genome, are very important, they cannot perform their jobs without the very complex regulatory functions of non-coding regions of the genome. And then here recently, just in December, tens of thousands of hidden dark genes discovered in humans. So they found even more. And so from that article, it says scientists dismiss these areas as non-functional, but they are now proving to hold essential instructions. So I kind of coined the word that Professor Dan is a junk DNA truther. I didn't know if I should feel bad about that. I asked what GPT thought, and it said, using truthers often implies a conspiratorial tone, likening someone to 9/11 truthers or flat earthers. That the person clings to outdated or debunked views despite mounting contrary evidence. So calling someone a junk DNA truther would suggest they still insist most non-coding DNA is useless, even though research shows regulatory, structural, and other vital functions. It's sarcastically accurate, but possibly too mocking for a formal setting, or too ambiguous if your audience isn't familiar with the prerogative nuance of truther. Okay. So, there are scientists out there, secular scientists, who admit that the problems for evolution are enormous. There was a website that had a scientific descent from Darwin some time ago. There's been quite a few scientists who have signed this. And it says this: we are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. Well, let's hope they do that. And then there's this new site, The Third Way of Evolution. And it's interesting when you read their rationale. It's the first thing you see on their page. And these are from, these are from evolutionists. And here's what it says: the vast majority of people believe that there are only two alternative ways to explain the origins of biological diversity. One way is creationism that depends upon intervention by a divine creator. That is clearly unscientific because it brings an arbitrary supernatural force into the evolution process. So are they interested in truth or not? So the commonly accepted alternative is neo-Darwinism. So this is where they're going to really trash on their, is their current theory. They have nothing else. So they say this: which is clearly naturalistic science, but ignores much of contemporary molecular evidence and invokes a set of unsupported assumptions about the accidental nature of hereditary variation. Neo-Darwinism ignores important rapid evolutionary processes such as symbiogenesis, horizontal DNA transfer, action of mobile DNA, and epigenetic modifications. Moreover, some neo-Darwinists have elevated natural selection into a unique creative force that solves all the difficult evolutionary problems without a real empirical basis. Many scientists today see the need for a deeper and more complete exploration of all aspects of the evolutionary process. Wow, what an admission. And I encourage those who are watching, and if you haven't seen the research that ICR is doing on, how God designed into the genome the ability to react to cues in the environment. And so not rely on, a lot of creationists still think that, well, natural selection can, mix around genes, and it could be a way that an organism adapts to its environment. ICR is showing that that isn't true. They've got some really compelling experiments in that area. I don't have any slides on that. I did want to cover that, but I did want to mention that. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And if one of the listeners, I'm drawing a blank, but I think it's something like environmental. I can't remember. So hopefully one of your listeners remember what the ICR program is all about. Okay. So evolution makes predictions, creationists cannot. This came from Bill Nye in his debate with Ken Ham. But let's look at that. Okay, you say evolution makes predictions. Well, how about the famous evolutionist J.B.S. Haldane? And he predicted that evolution could never produce various mechanisms such as the wheel and magnet, which would be useless till fairly perfect. But look at these functioning mechanical gears seen in nature for the first time. I mean, come on, did evolution really evolve that? This totally goes against the prediction of Haldane. And then if you look at Charles Darwin, when he said, to suppose that the eye with all its inevitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree possible. And now if you look at the trochlea, and we actually presented this to P.Z. Myers, and it was the trochlea challenge. So look at this. This trochlea, it threads through this sling, and not only, can you imagine, can you come up with a story how that's going to evolve, how that sling is going to find its way, or that cord, is going to find its way and thread through that sling. And then it's got to do it on the other side of your head. I mean, because this is, you got two eyes. So it's remarkable what evolutionists have to dream of to explain things like eye evolution. Bob Enyart interviewed a guy who wrote a book on the evolution of the eye, and interestingly, he couldn't provide a single example. In fact, Bob asked him, is there any examples of evolution of how the eye evolved in his book? And there wasn't. Okay, so the origin of language. So if you think of information from the context of language, that DNA is a language, computer programming is a language. So Darwin said this, and this, you could say this is another one of his predictions. Language slowly and unconsciously developed by many steps from primitive language consisting of grunts. But when you actually look at this scientifically, this is from Science Magazine a while back. People with least complex cultures have sophisticated languages with complex grammar and large vocabularies, can name and discuss anything that occurs in the sphere occupied by their speaker. The oldest language that can reasonably be constructed is already modern, sophisticated, and complete from an evolutionary point of view. And so this professor of MIT said this: many attempts have been made to determine an evolutionary origin of language, and all have failed. So now let's consider Google DeepMind. So DeepMind used evolutionary models like mind evolution to simulate how language could emerge naturalistically. And its AI struggled to reproduce the structure, logic, and abstraction found in human languages. Language games failed to scale into systems with grammar, recursion, and meaning like real language. Findings suggest language may not arise gradually from simple signals or sounds. No known AI system has modeled a believable evolutionary path from grunts to grammar, and it supports linguists like Noam Chomsky of MIT, who argue that language's origins remain a major scientific mystery. Okay, real quick, I wanted to look at another example. This is a box we designed for Caterpillar, and it was a telematics device that helped track heavy highway equipment, because believe it or not, people would steal these huge tractors, and this is a way to keep that from happening, among other things. Also making sure, people are working on a job site, whatnot. So there's this thing in software called a mutex. So if you have different processes that need to access something, it needs to request the right to do it, or have some way to protect it so that other processes don't come in and stomp on that shared object. So it's interesting, if you look at one of God's designs in nature. And this is from a dear friend of mine who went to be with the Lord a couple years ago during COVID. He just loved this example, and it's the whole process of fertilization and how that works. It's pretty remarkable. And so, first of all, there has to be a mechanism that prevents polyspermy. So two different sperm fertilizing the egg at the same time, because it's really, really bad. I mean, it's fatal. So there's two different mechanisms that God designed in here. There's a fast block that's electrical. And so the resting membrane potential across the egg changes from a certain amount of volts within 1 to 3 seconds after fertilization. Remarkable. And then there's a slow block that once that happens, cortical granulars release their contents into the space between the egg cell membrane and its outer coating, creating a hard envelope that sperm cannot get through. Lasts about a minute to remove all the remaining sperm from the egg. It's just a remarkable mechanism. So on cue, at the time of fertilization, we see the egg release thousands of packages, each dumping 1 million zinc atoms, and then it's quiet. Then there's another burst of zinc release. Each egg has 4 or 5 of these periodic sparks. It is beautiful to see, orchestrated much like a symphony. Wow, what a quote. So here's a particular paper that talks about that. But let's look at an example here. I hope you guys can see this. I'm going to go ahead and start this. There's no volume, but this is the zinc spark in mice. And if you just watch closely, you'll see when they get fertilized. Okay, I'm starting it now. And then if you look at this is the zinc spark in a human. Pretty remarkable. So it'll be cool when we learn a lot more about that from our creator. Okay. So to wrap up this talk, I'm not sure, Donnie, I was going to show a video, and I don't know if it'll come through, and it's how squids and octopus use camouflage. I'll start it for a moment, and if you can't hear it, we'll just skip the slide, and I would just encourage people to go watch this.
Okay.
Okay. Can you hear that?
I can't hear it, but I do think I know what the issue is, Fred.
Okay.
If you share screen and then click share tab audio, the audio would come in. So we could back up and do that, or you can just continue on. I guess it depends what you think would be best, Fred.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, you know what? We can continue on. We're about an hour in.
Yes,
I think.
It's going great. We got a lot of positive feedback, Fred.
Okay, great. And yeah, I would just encourage people to go watch that. It's a TED talk, and it's on how octopuses change and mask themselves to the environment. And when you see it, you think it's computer graphics, and it's not. It's just remarkable. So, there's SETI, search for interterrestrial intelligence. And again, I've got another video, but I'm not going to play it. But basically, it's a clip from the movie Contact. Or is that the name of the movie? Yeah, it was the one that Carl Sagan wrote a book. Yeah, Contact. So in the movie, Jodie Foster, when they hear a signal from outer space, she goes, "Oh, that can't be of naturalistic origin." And all it was a sequence of prime numbers. And so evolutionists will find the simplest kind of information and exclaim that it comes from intelligence, but see all this stuff around us and deny that there's information that comes from a creator. It's remarkable. So this is, of course, many creationists are familiar with this apologetics verse from Romans 8, chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. His invisible attributes, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they're without excuse. And, and also the Bible says in Hebrews that every house has a builder. So when I think of, well, how do you defend God? How do you defend creation? How do you argue against atheists? To me, the number one I appeal to is by the things that are made, because he says that that's overwhelming evidence, and we see that it is, so that they are without excuse. It's the number one argument, I believe, for God, and it's one that he uses in the Bible, or the Apostle Paul did. So if we consider faith from Webster's dictionary, it's a belief and trust in and loyalty to God, belief in the traditional doctrines of a religion, firm belief in something for which there is no proof, complete trust. And so that last one is what the world claims what faith is. Well, that's actually the faith of an evolutionist in the science, their so-called science that they believe shows materialism. But Hebrews 11:1 has the correct definition of faith. It's the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So John the Baptist has sent us to you saying, are you the coming one, or do we look for another? And so John the Baptist in prison, he had some doubts, he's human. And what did Jesus say to him? Did he say, ye of little faith? No, this is what Jesus said in answer to him. Go and tell John the things that you have seen and heard, that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who is not offended because of me. He did not say, ye of little faith. He said, go and tell John the things you have seen and heard. Okay, well, that wraps up my presentation. I appreciate the opportunity to share this.
Fred, that flew by. The reason why is because that presentation was packed with valuable information on the creation versus evolution debate. It proved that it truly is a great time to be a biblical creationist. Fred, I would not want to be an evolutionist, as in the kind of person that believes all life, whales, pine trees, strawberries, banana plants are related through common ancestry. After listening to that presentation, that really, a lot of the points you made, and you mentioned this in your presentation, Fred, information science, for example, really is the death of naturalistic origins.
Yeah, thank you, Donnie. And I appreciate what you're doing, because we need to get this truth out to as many people as we can, because we just interviewed a scientist from China and the years that she spent as an unbeliever. And, this is a way we can reach a lot of people, because they've been indoctrinated at their schools, the museums, they watch the TV and they hear about millions of years. And this information's out there. We just, we need to share it as much as we can and try to save as many people as we can.
Amen. We could win arguments all day, but it is about winning souls. He that winneth souls is wise.
Yeah.
And you guys over at Real Science Radio are doing a fantastic job. I appreciate the kind words towards what we're doing here at Standing for Truth, because for many reasons, but one of them, Fred, is you brothers are utilizing social media, utilizing YouTube. You're putting out high production value material. And a video I just watched last night, I watched several, but one that stood out to me from your channel, and I want to recommend people go check it out, is the Earth might be way younger than you think. And you go over many of my favorite pieces of evidence for a young Earth creation. Fred, I like how you guys pointed to the top pieces of evidence for young Earth creation that we both know that the critics, the skeptics, really have no good answer for.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a list of not so old things. It was the very first list show we ever did. Bob Inyard had come up with this idea. We got to start doing list shows, and that was our first one. And so we've been adding to that list, over time. So that was a lot of fun doing that show.
If you were in an elevator, I like to call this the elevator pitch, Fred. And you're in an elevator, you got a couple minutes with a skeptic, somebody who's actually open-minded. And because I am confronted with a lot of critics, and a question I like to ask is, let's just say, before we get into a discussion on the evidence, if creation were true, or if specifically Christianity were true, would you be a Christian? And surprisingly, but I guess not surprisingly anymore, brother, there are several atheists that have answered that question with no. That even if, we've heard that from people like Aaron Ra, even if God himself, Jesus Christ, God manifest in the flesh, came down and said, I'm real, and gave that skeptic proof, they would still refuse to worship him. Isn't that wild, Fred?
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. It reminds me of a story on Facebook. So a fellow, friend I was in a fraternity, fellow fraternal brother, if you will. So he had made some comment on Facebook, and I commented back, like, well, hey, Tim, it's good to see that you're on Facebook. And you're going to find that if you check out my particular Facebook page, you'll see I don't agree with what you're saying. So we ended up getting into this debate, and really what it boiled down to was a little bit of science. But then what happens a lot of times, they'll start attacking the Bible. If they're losing the science argument, they'll attack the Bible. Mm-hmm. So he started attacking slavery. So I started with the whole slavery argument. And when we got to the end of this particular exchange, and he's a really smart guy. He was the smartest guy in our fraternity. He was the top engineer. And I said, Tim, all this evidence, wouldn't it just be better if you admitted you hated God? Because that's really what it is, isn't it? Because you can't refute any of this science, and your attempt at trashing the Bible didn't work. And he admitted to me that he thought about it. It's like, that's what it is. I just hate God. And I'm like, well, at least that's a start, because just think how harmful it would be to you, how hurt you would be. You'd almost rather have your kids say they hate you because you can work on your relationship than for them to completely ignore you and never and say you don't exist. And so at least that was a start with him. But you're right. I mean, a lot of times, like you said with Aaron Ra, they just hate God is what it boils down to.
Yeah. So which is just confirmation of what the Bible says in passages like Romans 1. So
exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I guess assuming that they're open-minded, you're in an elevator and you only got a couple minutes, Fred, and somebody is curious. They're on the fence, they're agnostic. Maybe they've never been in the same room or place with an informed young earth creationist, a biblical creationist. And so if they were curious as to what the scientific evidence is to support young earth creation, what are some of your favorite pieces of evidence to point to in a short amount of time to help plant a seed, basically?
Yeah. Well, one of the first ones that pops into my mind when I've been in this kind of situation is just how the DNA can program for different sequences. And so what I tell them is, imagine writing a book that tells a really good story, and then you read the book backwards, and remarkably, it tells another story. And you're like, how could that possibly be? That's ingenious.
Right.
And then I tell them, well, that's what God did in the DNA. And, this isn't some creationist or Christian website saying this. This is the secular science. And then I'll, bring up the whole soft tissue in dinosaur bones. I brought that up with coworkers who are not believers. And I had one guy, when I told him that, he says, that's not true. And then I showed him the scientific articles that were not from creationists, from Discover magazine. And he was amazed. I mean, he was investigating that particular webpage the whole rest of the day. And I hope I planted a seed with him. There have been examples of friends of mine who are not believers who eventually came around to the truth. I don't know if it was the seeds that we planted with science, but that's what we hope we do, because we know, Paul said that it's hard to reach the Greeks who don't have the foundation of Jesus. They're taught, they don't believe there's a God, or they believe in naturalism. Well, the cross is foolishness to them. So then you start with creation, like Paul did in Acts 17. And you start with the foundation of the scripture, because the Bible says without the foundations, what can the righteous do if the foundations are destroyed? So Satan is incredibly intelligent. He knows if he wipes Genesis out of where you believe is true, if he can make you doubt Genesis, why believe the rest of the Bible? And so I start with, some of the design arguments, kind of like Paul talked about in Romans 1. And then the dinosaurs, everybody likes to talk about dinosaurs. So at least it plants the seed. And the good thing about dinosaurs, it also refutes this whole idea that the earth is millions of years old. So
Fred, that is an excellent response. And any open-minded person who's willing to be as objective as possible would consider those. And the first one, DNA, these multiple overlapping codes, I've seen you discuss that before, and it truly is fascinating, as we write books that can be read forwards, but DNA can literally be read both forwards, backwards, and every other DNA letter, ATCG. You get a third message.
Yeah, even
third
a third, even diagonally, it's mind-boggling.
Yes.
Yeah.
And doesn't that make genetic degeneration this problem that evolutionists struggle with? The accumulation of these nearly neutral, low impact, slightly deleterious mutations. Because if you have 3 or 4 messages in a single string of nucleotides, then one deleterious mutation could mess up several messages within the code.
Exactly. And that's just what that one scientist that I quoted had pointed out. Yeah, serious problem for them. I mean, it's just not overcomable. And Dr. Samford, I'm sure you're familiar with his work. I like his analogy of the princess and the pea, with a mutation occurs in the body. Natural selection can only work on an entire organism. It can't see any kind of supposed beneficial mutation. And so it can never detect that because of the noise created by all the other mutations. There's no way that you could ever evolve anything. Sometimes they appeal to chaos, and I tell them, well, and they'll say, well, if you have enough typing monkeys over millions of years, they could type out one of Shakespeare's sonnets, which doesn't work mathematically, by the way, because you would need like 10 to the 80th power of typing monkeys just to get the first, I think, 100 characters of a sonnet. But what I tell them is, consider you're like, a TV with noise. And over time, every now and then, if you have enough time, will noise on a TV eventually show my face? Will it show your face, Donnie? Okay, so say it does after zillions and zillions of years. The next image, will it show me with a thumbs up? What are the odds of that? Information continually gets torn apart by randomness. You can't get around it. It's just, there's no way to escape it.
It's incredible, Fred. It really is incredible. And what you said there on selection, acting on, in technical terms, the phenotype versus the genotype, is a huge problem for guardians of common descent, is what I like to call them. Because that means, as you said, natural selection is not examining or analyzing every single nucleotide. Oh, here's a deleterious mutation. We'll get rid of that. Oh, this one's okay. We'll leave that. No, it's either the whole organism or nothing at all, which means populations descend more and more into genetic sickness. Isn't that right, Fred?
That's right. Yeah. And I remembered the ICR project is continuous environmental tracking.
Yes.
So
yeah.
I just drew a blank at that point in the presentation.
Actually, in our conference a few weeks ago, we had Dr. Randy Galuza, who is leading that position, continuous environmental tracking. And I'm glad you brought it up, because now we're finding, I'm wondering if you could speak to this, because our skeptics in the chat, I asked them to present what they think are the best examples of a truly non-reductive beneficial mutation. Because Dr. Sanford has pointed out, and you also mentioned Sal, they've pointed out that the vast majority of beneficial mutations, when you actually look at the genotype, look under the hood, what's going on, they're reductive. They're functionally compromising to organisms. They're not moving things forward. But are we now seeing that a lot of the best so-called examples of beneficial mutation, Fred, are examples of the pre-existing ability to adapt based on environmental triggers?
Well, I definitely hold to what ICR, they approached it from an engineering point of view.
Yeah.
And if you think of God as the ultimate engineer, it would make sense that he would have this programmed in. And the fact that they're doing it in very few generations, in some cases, no generations, right, it's got to be programmed in. The ability to track, to adapt to the environment based on certain environmental cues. And that's design. Neo-Darwinism requires all mutations to be random. In fact, my college evolution textbook says that non-random mutations do not occur. It's a major tenet of evolution that they don't occur. And so you've got evolutionist scientists now that are starting to realize that that's not a true statement. It's been disproven. And so neo-Darwinism is dead. We've had Sal Cordova on, and they're in the evolution literature, they admit neo-Darwinism is dead. Okay, if it's dead, then you got to come up with another theory, and they don't have one. They just don't. And as I would appeal to, those listening to really, God isn't this bad ogre in the sky that you think he is.
Right.
He died. He died for all of our sins. We all deserve to go to hell. But he paid the price for us. And it's just remarkable what he did. And what's amazing is Christianity is the easiest religion. All you have to do is accept the free gift. That's it. You don't have to sing Kumbaya. You don't have to get around a fire and hold hands. And, it's, you don't have to, bow your head 3 times a day. The very fact that you get the law lifted out from your life, you're freed from the law and you've been given grace. And it's just remarkable. It's an easy choice. It's an easy religion. I just wish more people would realize that. Just accept Christ as paying for your sins, accept him as your Lord and Savior. He's a really cool dude, and you'll be set for eternity.
Amen. True biblical Christianity is a religion of done rather than do, or all your false religions. You gotta do something, like you said, do X, Y, Z. Maybe you'll be good enough or accounted righteous by God. But true Christianity is it's done. It's been paid for. Jesus did all the work, and we just got to accept that free gift, Fred.
Yep.
And so again, more excellent points, and how the evolutionists would respond to this challenge of mutation accumulation that they're building up. They build up unchecked because the majority of mutations are nearly neutral. They're slightly deleterious, meaning they're what? Invisible to selection. Selection can't see them. So they're not subject to selection. They're subject to genetic drift. They spread, they degenerate. But their argument is, well, eventually they'll build up enough, Fred, to where now the population is at a point of genetic sickness where selection can see the genetic load and remove it from the equation. So remove those harmful individuals from the equation. It's still an appeal to natural selection, but I guess it's an appeal over time. Eventually it builds up enough to where Mother Nature can see the load. What, in your opinion, would be a good counter to an evolutionist who argued that way?
Well, again, from an information point of view, when you're always going to have, and if you're appealing to neo-Darwinism, which you pretty much have to if you're a materialist, because you have to have random mutations. Otherwise, you're admitting to design. So when you have random mutations, you're always going to have more than beneficial mutations. So even if we gave you 1 in 1,000, the noise caused by the harmful mutations, you'll never be able to overcome. Even if you build up this genetic load and somehow magically you come along and you get rid of this genetic load. And by the way, that's called truncation selection. And I know plenty of evolutionists who say that they admit that that's just not true. You don't see it in nature. Right. Okay, if it's true, if you guys are appealing to truncation selection, can you provide examples in nature and it really just provide a scientific explanation that accounts for information in the genome? And as my talk showed, information goes even deeper than that. Try to explain quantum information at that level. It's just becoming just so difficult for the evolutionists to do this.
Fred, I really appreciate your knowledge and how up to date you are on these issues. And that's the result of engaging the critics like you've done over at your channel, Professor Dave being one of them. You've done an excellent job. And so, yes, that's not going to solve the problem. These aren't realistic. These mechanisms, they look to truncation selection, synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanism. And I like to say, okay, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's give them the most amount of unrealistic selection. And so if you had a room of 100 people and we were to say, okay, get rid of the most mutant individuals. So now you're left with what? 50% of people who are still more mutant than the previous generation. And that's genetic entropy. Isn't that right, Fred? So even
Yeah,
with all that
exactly.
massive
Yep.
amounts of unrealistic selection, it's that the next generation is always a little bit more mutant than the
Yeah.
previous one.
The arrow is just downhill. Thank goodness we've got the quality control mechanism in our genomes, but we are, we're in, creation has fallen. And so every generation we slightly deteriorate. And the science actually supports that as well. With IQ tests dropping over time, the genius of ancient man. I mean, we're slightly deteriorating every generation. I used to, correspond with Dr. James Crow, and he talked about the deteriorating human race.
Yeah.
And he was an evolutionist, and I asked him, why do you believe in evolution if you're in your own field it doesn't work? And he's like, well, I believe, they've got it all figured out in astronomy and paleontology, but yet in his own field he could not defend evolution.
It's a miracle that we can sit here and talk and stream live to people all around the planet in light of the fact that we're what? A copy of a copy of a copy of a copy going right back to Adam, who was created very good, free of mutations, but we've got quite the genetic load. And so their next point would be, which you largely addressed in your presentation, which I really appreciate, we're going to have to make some clips out of some of the things you said. Nylon digestion by bacteria, gene duplication, for example, those are still appealed to, Fred. And so they'll say, well, you'll eventually get a true beneficial mutation that's large enough to counterbalance the damage that is being done through the accumulation of just thousands and thousands of slightly deleterious mutations. But correct me if I'm wrong, Fred, you're showing that even their best beneficial mutations, like nylon digestion by bacteria, they're either the result of pre-programming, epigenetics, or they're reductive, like sickle cell anemia. Okay, there's a small advantage with people who have malaria, but under the hood, when you look at what's going on at the genotype, let's say genetically, it's due to a broken cell and it's a deformed hemoglobin molecule, from my understanding, Fred. So is that really going to save the day for them?
It's not. And, Dr. Tom Schneider, who is the Marxist evolutionist scientist at NIH, he's the one who really does understand information theory. And I asked him, can you provide any example of where uncertainty is reduced and you can document it as something that isn't just like a one-off? And he appealed to a program he wrote. It's like, well, okay, well, you've programmed that. When you did that program, first of all, you were using truncation selection, but you programmed it to pass. So the information is basically zero because you already had your output. You were looking for a specific output, and so his program did no such thing. He wrote it as an undergrad. I was surprised that he actually attempted to publish it, but they're just so desperate to show ways where this can happen. And I'd be curious if an evolutionist can even give me an example of a Shannon increase in information. Right. Even in that regard, it's really hard for them to show any kind of consistent increase of information over time. It's just not possible with science, information science. It just totally refutes their ability to do that.
Fred, typically in a debate, and I know you talked about this in your presentation, but typically what the critic will do to avoid, I think, answering the question in a sophisticated manner about new information, Shannon information, an increase in complexity, they'll stop and they'll press us to give them a coherent definition of what we mean by information. And so I'm curious, Fred, if we're confronted by a skeptic or an atheist in the middle of a discussion or debate, and they say, Fred, Donny, what is your definition of information? What's the best way for us to answer that, in your opinion?
Well, for me, I answer it with what they like to use, which is Shannon information, but they misunderstand Shannon information. So that's why I use it. They think that Shannon uncertainty is information, and it's not. And they misread Shannon's paper. It wasn't the purpose of his paper. He was writing an engineering paper for channel throughput. But there was a lot of useful things that came out of that paper. So I will approach information. I try to on their terms, because if you try to use, I think I said Meyer, but it was Dembski who came up with complex specified information. Yeah. They'll just poo-poo it. Well, that's an ID guy, and he's not credible. And so that's why I speak on their terms. Shannon information. They love to appeal to Shannon information, it's because they misunderstand it. They make uncertainty. They claim that randomness is information, which couldn't be farther from the truth. And when they make that claim, I used to have Tom Schneider as an ally say, hey, go talk to Dr. Schneider and he'll tell you that you're wrong. And he's one of you guys. That's how I approach it. And I'm not going to say that's the best for everybody. But as an engineer, it's the type of information I understand the best.
It makes a lot of sense. And so typically the follow-up then, I hosted a debate recently between an anti-creationist, Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, and Dr. Jerry Bergman, who you've had on, fantastic creation speaker. And on this topic, the evolutionary biologist asked Dr. Bergman, okay, in terms of providing you an example of a beneficial mutation that adds new information, how would we quantify that? How would we be able to tell that the organism without this beneficial mutation and now the organism with that beneficial mutation, how can we tell genetically if this is still a loss or a true gain? And I guess in light of what you're saying, Fred, a gain in Shannon information, how could we best engage that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'd be curious. That's a debate I missed. I'm going to have to go back and watch.
It's a good one.
I'm curious to hear, because I know Jerry Bergman is, he's an expert at the molecular level. He dealt with mutations as part of his career.
Yes.
But to how to actually get them to make a claim that how we can say, okay, well, here's how we can know that it's a beneficial mutation.
Yeah.
I guess you'd have to show that it was a mutation that you can isolate to a species, and it's funny because if it's a mutation, a random mutation to something functional, it's going to break that functional item.
Right.
And I know Professor Dave had tried to give an example of, information adding mutations. And I don't quite remember the argument. But they're trying to put the burden on us. And yet I would say, hey, can you explain to us why you think this is a increase in function, an improvement of function? And are they able to establish that this wasn't a dormant feature that got turned on? And I know that they can say, well, then you're appealing to, you're coming up with a way to get around the problem. You've come up with an excuse. Well, in the long run, I'll always appeal to what my knowledge is of noise and how anything random cannot produce information. It just can't over time. It loses every time. It's remarkable that they think that it could produce information, and that's what they have to hope that it does, and it just can't.
Well, Fred, you made several fantastic points. Firstly, the burden of proof is on them. They're telling us that fish evolved into fishermen. They're telling us that bacteria-like organisms evolved into biologists over time, fish, amphibian, reptiles, mammals. And so the burden of proof is on them to show us true examples of mutations that add real meaningful information, increase phenotypic complexity, and are not reductive, or what you said, but we can actually demonstrate what you just said, Fred, about the fact that you have a lot of genes that are turned off, and then given the right stressor or environmental trigger, that gene can be turned on for rapid adaptation. Dr. Randy Galuza has shown many papers about fish rapidly adapting based on the pre-existing information to do so. And so they're going to have a tough job then. They got to show us that this is, for one, not pre-programmed information, and two, if it's a true mutation, that it's not reductive in any way, Fred.
Exactly. And that's why they appeal to, they try to get gene duplication to work, because they need, extra genome to work on, to mutate. And it's remarkable that when you just do your own research, just do a search either with Chat GPT or just Google search, and you look for gene duplication, you come up with all kinds of cancers and diseases.
That's right. You showed that in your presentation. And it would be like if I have a book and then I give you a second copy or maybe a million copies of the book that you already have. Is that really any new meaningful information, Fred, or is that just the same information now duplicated
Yeah,
2, 3, 4 times.
yeah, it's not. It's the same information. It's not an increase in information.
And then they look to, oh, I'm sorry, Fred, go ahead.
And even Shannon theory shows that. And that could be a whole nother, another segment, or it would take me time to explain that. But Shannon information also supports it. It's not double the information.
And so
that's a good point to make, that, even if you were able to duplicate a gene, like you said with your book, you didn't double your information.
It's amazing because I've got Dr. Sanford's book behind me, Genetic Entropy, and he's got a section near the end. It's in the appendix section, and it deals specifically with gene duplication. And it's a technical chapter, but I recommend everybody check it out. And he points out that if you duplicate a region of the genome, you're also duplicating the degeneration. You're duplicating the damage, the deleterious mutations. And so gene duplication isn't really helping the cause. It's not helping to slow down genetic degeneration in many cases, especially the cases where it causes disease, like you mentioned. Fred, did you mention pancreatic cancer was linked?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And the fact that we're finding that the genome is not junk too, it's shrinking their ability to find anything. Because they would need more of the DNA to be junk to then work on that junk to evolve something. But the fact that the genome isn't junk, it already refutes the common ancestor with chimps. It's just not possible mathematically. But it's closing the window for them to have anything to even work on, because then they have to mutate something that's already has some function.
Right. So it's really, and the fancy term that they like to use is neo-functionalization. So a region of the genome is duplicated, and then that duplicated region can now change neutrally. So it's going to change as compared to the original one through beneficial mutation accumulation and maybe result in a new function. But if the vast majority of mutations are deleterious, it would be like if I were to give you a copy of a book I already own, and then in the second copy, okay, that we're going to change that with typographical errors. Is typographical errors in your second copy of a book you already own, is that going to make the second book better? I think it's going to make it worse.
In fact, that's an example of a decrease in information, because if you have two books and one of them has a typo in it, or let's say one of them just has a different phrasing and it kind of tells slightly different story, you don't know which one's the correct story. So you have you have an increase of uncertainty. It's an actual loss of information in that particular case.
It's incredible. It's kind of like transitional forms, Fred, in my opinion, because we could sit here and argue with the evolutionist all day about a dozen possible examples, and I think we can refute every single one. And then when it comes to beneficial mutations, we can sit here and argue with the best that the evolutionist camp has to offer, their PhD scientists, and yet we're still going to argue over the same dozen over and over again. Sickle cell anemia, nylon digestion by bacteria. There's several others that they look to. But shouldn't this be without question? If evolution is true, we shouldn't be sitting here debating about the usual 10 or 12. They should have millions of true beneficial mutations that they could throw at us. And we say, yep, there's no debate. There's no question. That would be real science. Isn't that right, Fred?
That's right. Yeah, that's a really good point. So we're on the winning side. We're just trying to, make these, everybody who's a skeptic, there's the evidence just isn't going your way.
It really isn't. And so I asked the chat as your presentation was going on. We've had a lively live chat. We get a good mix, Fred.
Yeah. I saw a few pop up here now. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll put this one on screen. And a major one that's been used is nylon digestion, but you addressed that and I appreciate it. And so here's a couple more that they use. And again, even if, and we're not even saying these are true beneficial mutations, but you can see in the literature, you pointed out a couple of papers as well, as to just to stop genetic degeneration, how many children you'd have to have, how many offspring, just an unrealistic amount. That's wild. And so even if they were to have 10 or 20, even 100 true beneficial mutations, that's not going to counterbalance the damage that's being done through all these thousands and thousands of deleterious mutations. But a couple that they point to, and I've got a couple thoughts on these. Sydney Raptor says lactase persistent. So the fact that some adults, if I remember correctly, can digest lactose. But from my understanding of that, as babies, we can digest lactose. But once we start to wean off of breastfeeding and the need to digest lactose, that gene is shut off. But in some people, it's permanently turned on, either due to a mutation or epigenetics. So
Yeah,
firstly, I don't see how that's going to save the day for them. Fred, what are your thoughts on that example?
well, yeah, I agree with you 100%. In fact, I saw a study at some time in the past, and we mentioned it on our show about how they think it was a harmful mutation that makes you have the ability to keep drinking milk. I happen to be one of those people who is now lactose intolerant. And, I believe God programmed us to wean off of milk. Right. And I didn't for many years. And so I finally went to the doctor, started getting concerned. And he told me I had irritable bowel syndrome. So I went home and I looked it up. And do you know that irritable bowel syndrome is a made up disease? At least that was my research. It's basically a disease where they don't know what's going on. And then I had a doctor, a friend of mine, and he said, Fred, if you need to, I told him that I went off milk for a week. And he said, you got to do it for a month. And 3 weeks later, I realized, hey, I was lactose intolerant. It completely cured my problem. Wow. And so I had looked into it, and to exactly what you said, there's a mutation, and the science paper I saw said that the belief was that it was the deleterious mutation, or the slightly harmful one, for those who can continue to drink milk. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know. But to use that as any kind of evidence of evolution, I don't know how that would help at all.
Fred, what do you mean? You don't believe that fish evolved into fishermen, or a single-celled like ancestor evolved into a whale because some people can digest milk?
Yeah,
I mean, come
exactly.
on. I mean, that's as proof to something as you can get.
Well, drinking more milk, makes your bones healthier or whatever. And so you get selected and,
Well, I'm sold. Yeah. So if an evolutionist salesman came to my house and mentioned that, I would say, okay, you got me. I'm related to a banana plant.
Yeah.
That is enough for some of them to believe that, Fred.
Yeah. I've had, like I said earlier, I've had PhD scientists tell me that cancer is an example of evolution at work.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep.
Unbelievable.
They're desperate.
And like you said, with these diseases, yeah, that's the evolutionary thinking. Treat everything with chemicals, or there's a lot of symptoms that they don't really know what this is, so they make up a disease name. Even though,
another thing too, talking about gene duplication. Well, this whole thing of jumping genes, right, transposons or whatever they're called, that's remarkable. Because as a programmer trying to think, how would I do that? We've got this piece of hardware, we've got the address and data bus, and you're going to somehow have a piece of code that you're going to insert over here, and then you're going to execute that, and then somehow you can insert another one here and then take it out. That's pretty cool. That's remarkable. And how you can explain that from an evolutionary and point of view. How did that evolve naturalistically? They just have way too many hurdles to overcome. His invisible attributes are clearly seen so that they're without excuse.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, these retrotransposons, they're functional DNA elements that pop out of the genome in one location, and then they insert themselves into another location within the genome. But as a result, this actually turns genes on and off, which ends up affecting various traits within the genome. So it's pre-programmed adaptation.
Yeah, absolutely. The more we learn about that, it's just so cool, reverse engineering this stuff. And that's the key. We're reverse engineering from the ultimate engineer, that you just can't explain this stuff. It's design. And if you try to, I was going to say, if you try to do this from a materialistic point of view, you just won't be able to do it. You have to you have to reverse engineer things with the mindset of intelligence and design. And that's what they do. They won't admit that, but in order to effectively reverse engineer something, that's what you have to do. You have to assume it was designed. It's from intelligence.
That's right. It's a great point. That's an important point too, Fred. And because natural selection, these evolutionary mechanisms, these neo-Darwinian evolutionary mechanisms, they lack forethought. They lack foresight. They don't care about us getting cancer in 50 years. They're worried about here and now. But yet these mechanisms that you've been pointing to, retrotransposons being one of them, or these adaptive events that we see, continuous environmental tracking, for example. These require forward thinking. And Fred, you being an engineer, when it comes to engineering or when it comes to computer code, isn't that type of design, isn't that evidence of forward thing? Human engineers putting these things in, designing things this way because they're thinking ahead, which would point to God, the forward thinker.
Yeah, absolutely. And it could provide a way to do something more efficiently. I mean, how many things have we learned, even in like our memory technology, all the different things that we've developed by looking at the design in nature? We're looking at, quantum mechanics and coming up with these super fast computers. And it's looking at design. It's remarkable, how man can improve different inventions by looking at how something in nature does it. Something, say they're working on a robot and they look at how do, grasshoppers use their legs or whatever. And they learn a lot from looking at it and looking at it from a viewpoint of, hey, this is something that's a lot better designed and a lot more efficient. It's a lot of fun, actually, being on this side and as an engineer and just seeing his design. It's just mind blowing. It just truly is.
It is. It's why I like to say it's a great time to be a biblical creationist. We have too much fun doing this, Fred. And so the second one here, tetrachromacy. So I first heard about this one months back in a debate that I hosted. And so I looked into it, and apparently it's a rare condition where a person has 4 types of cone cells in their eyes. And as a result, Fred, it allows them to perceive a wider range of colors than the typical 3 cone vision that you and I might experience. And I thought, okay, I bet there's some degenerative effects or negative effects to this. And I looked it up, and I know you and your co-host were talking about blue eyes, having lighter eyes could actually result in you being more sensitive to white. I have blue eyes, and I'm more sensitive to screens, more sensitive to the sun and bright lights. And guess what? It turns out that this so-called beneficial mutation is the same thing. People who have it, which is a very small amount of people, they suffer with light sensitivity or starbursts over certain lights. And so that was just a quick bit of research. And so anyways, I'm curious as to your thoughts, Fred, if you've heard of that one, but is it a surprise that these also have negative effects associated with them?
No, I had not heard of that. I was curious when I saw it here on the screen. So, my first thought was, I mean, I agree with you that I wouldn't be surprised to find a harmful effect, but, maybe that particular side effect is part of the fall. And, we've done shows on, these incredible, what are they called, where people can do just incredible things that just blow people out of the water. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the word. It's
where you see these shows like America's Got Talent, where they go on there and
what's it called? Like this Clark, where Stephen Curry. They're prodigies, but it's a different word. It's like they've got a special talent. It's like something that God, it kind of reveals how great things would have been, and he shut certain aspects off in our brain because we were already showing to be pretty wicked after the fall. And you think of Annie Oakley and how she could shoot at a pretty good distance and split a card in 2. So some people have certain special gifts that kind of tap in like a window into what we once were before the fall. And so I did think of that as a possibility. And who knows, because, I just think our capabilities are going to be so much greater when we're in heaven. And, I hope somebody can remember what I'm just drawing a blank on let me look real quick.
Maybe we'll give a prize to someone in the live chat if you can
Yeah.
remember or think of the name or title to what you're describing. And that's such a good point, that it's giving us a glimpse or a sneak preview into heaven, but also into the pre-fallen world, because we know the color spectrum in heaven in eternity is going to be much greater, much more amazing than it is today.
Yeah, the word is savant, by the way. That's the
Okay.
word I was stumbling to remember. So,
Yeah, Kathleen Norton got it. So
yeah, so savants are just, we've done stories on those, and it's incredible to consider what they can do. Like this one boy had heard his mom play the piano and heard it on the radio. And then all of a sudden he could play the piano when he sat down at a piano without ever practicing. That's a savant. These guys, this one guy who could fly in an airplane and just look at a city once and then go home and draw the whole city, everything he saw to perfection. Wow. So to us, it's like tapping into something that shows our original potential and the potential that, that we're looking forward to in heaven, how many things are going to be unlocked. So when I heard about that vision, I thought, is it possible that maybe if we see more colors, is that a tapping into, is that a savant thing? Or I wasn't surprised to hear that it also has negative, effects too. So I'm always trying to think from a design and from a spiritual, from a God point of view. What, how does this fit with the Bible? How does it fit with science? And so to me, for them to try to use that as an evidence of evolution, they're gnawing at just little grains of sand.
At straws.
Yeah. It's like taking a dollar bill out of Josh Allen's $330 million contract. That's such a small, minor thing. And like you said, you're grasping at straws.
These are akin to, they're not going to save the day because they're desperate to solve this genetic degeneration problem because they know it's a real problem. And it would be like, maybe to make an analogy, make it more understandable to the audience. If I wanted temporarily, Fred, better gas mileage in my car, I could start removing weight from the car, remove the interior seats, maybe the side mirrors. Okay. So temporarily, yeah, I'm going to have better gas mileage, but overall I'm destroying the car. I'm removing weight from the car. That doesn't explain how the interior seating evolved in the first place, or the side mirrors. And then maybe with that car that I'm in a way destroying, okay, I take it to get serviced, change the oil, change the tires, get a new windshield. That's not stopping the overall degeneration of the car. I mean, it's inevitable. And I think that's what we see in the biological world, Fred. I wonder if you think the same thing, where we see either general adaptation or so-called beneficial mutations, but at the end of the day, they're reductive, like sickle cell anemia.
Yeah. And, it reminded me of our show we did on alcohol and alcoholism and its impact. I mean, there's initially, you can get a positive impact, but if you got to watch our show on alcohol, because you don't know about the harmful effects. Yeah. You may have a temporary moment of, enjoying things or whatever, having even more clarity in your mind. Say you're doing cocaine, there's a negative impact. So to your analogy with stripping down the car, there's always going to be payback, and the payback is generally worse. And it was so interesting, when we did our show on alcohol and on marijuana, on the harmful effects that people just aren't aware of, so.
Yeah, it's a trade-off, but it's a trade-off that's not going to help those who believe in fish to fisherman evolution. Like I've seen in the chat, and I've seen many people point to Lenski's bacteria, the long-term, large-scale evolutionary experiment, where they point to a couple beneficial mutations. But what we've actually seen is these bacteria, they've shrunk in functional genome size. These beneficial mutations are largely due to the destruction of pre-existing systems. They're lazy, they're handicapped. And so sure, there's a trade-off, but is that trade-off sustainable, Fred?
Oh, absolutely not. No, good point. Good way to present that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this one point you made, I want to touch as we start to wind things out. I wanted to touch on this because you have talked about this in your videos, which I highly recommend people check out. And you give several other really good talks. So hopefully we can have you on again, Fred. This is great. But you mentioned the dinosaur soft tissue and also the collagen, these biomolecules that we find in, from my understanding, we had Dr. Brian Thomas on during our conference a few weeks ago. And he said basically almost in every layer of the geologic rock strata, you're finding fossils now with soft tissue, biomolecules, DNA. Fred, you've talked about they now find fresh DNA. And so can these really last millions of years?
Well, they can't. And you know what's super interesting? They're even finding soft tissue in, of all things, trilobites. Have you heard about that?
Yeah, I heard you
Trilobites.
talk
They're
about it.
supposed
Yeah.
to be, and they call them simple. And if you look at the trilobite, it's nothing simple at all about it. It's a very complex organism. But they've even found soft tissue in trilobites. It's, you know, there's no way this stuff can be millions of years old. DNA can't last that long, and yet they're finding even DNA in dinosaur bones. You know, DNA is a very weak. It breaks down easily, and how that can somehow be preserved, there's just no way. In fact, if you go to Rational Wiki, it'll say that you should not find DNA in dinosaur bones, and they haven't removed that claim because we actually then did find DNA in dinosaur bones. So they predicted, well, you won't. Well, guess what we did? So you're going to stop believing in evolution? No, they're not going to, unfortunately. So
when they're committed to that worldview, they're going to come up with a rescue device. They're going to come up with a way to rescue the theory.
Well, we offered Jack Horner, I think, somewhere north of $12,000 to carbon test the bones that he found. You know, he was finding with Mary Schweitzer, and he did not agree to. He did not take us up on our offer.
I was just about to ask you that. Yeah, and why is that?
Well, because he knew that they were going to find carbon-14 in these dinosaur bones, and carbon-14 only has a half-life of like 5,600 some odd years. And, you know, after, 100,000 years, you should not be able to detect any carbon anymore because, carbon-14 decays into nitrogen. So it's a little clock that's ticking. And the remarkable thing that we've talked about too many times is how, we find carbon-14 in everything. We find it in diamonds. Diamonds are a hard substance. Why do they still have carbon-14 trapped in them? That should have long decayed into nitrogen because it's radioactive. Yet we find it in diamonds that are supposed to be millions of years old. So whenever I go to the mall and someone brings up, oh, these diamonds, the real ones, they're millions of years old. I tell them, well, that's actually not true. And my wife kind of is like, okay, don't go too far with, it's just a, poor salesperson that doesn't know any better. But hey, I like to kind of inform them and say, hey, look into this. Yeah. These diamonds are maybe, who knows how old they are, but they're under 6,000 years old.
It's a good way to witness. The skeptics will say, oh, well, many skeptics will just deny it. They're not up to date on it.
Yep.
Those that are up to date, more informed, they'll say, well, there's nearby nuclear material to where the diamonds are. Maybe that can recharge the C14 in the diamonds, Fred.
Yep. Well, yeah, they've done everything. They've prevented contamination, everything they can do. And I haven't seen any scientific studies where they can explain how you can get carbon-14 in diamonds. So,
yeah. And from my understanding, the rate team, and this is what's so important about creation, is that we can make testable predictions. I mean, you're offering Horner 22,000. If that
was that, yeah, I don't remember where that number ended up, but yeah.
That's wild because you're confident that, okay, we're going to find C14 in this dinosaur bone because we're starting from the position that says the earth is young. So we can make a prediction. We can make a prediction on dinosaur soft tissue, functional DNA. And so that's the gold standard of science, making predictions. But on the C14, the rate team, they made several predictions, but they looked into this claim that, oh, nearby nuclear material could recharge the C14 in diamonds. And guess what, Fred? They looked into that. It doesn't work. Apparently you'd need like 22 or 30,000 times the normal nuclear material to do so. It's just a rescue. Every single rescue device they've put forth on C14 and diamonds has failed. And Fred, did you not put out a video response to Professor Dave on that topic?
Yes, we did. Absolutely. Yep. That was a lot of fun. So, and thanks to Daniel, I just saw your comment. Thanks for clarifying the 22K. That was a lot more than we raised to send a flat earther into space.
That still wouldn't be enough.
I think that's the one we got to 12,000 on, if I recall.
Yeah, they'd go to space and just say this is all a big green screen.
Exactly.
Because we've seen the appeals because we've had Will Duffy on.
I was just going to say, yeah, you had Will on recently. Yeah, he did some great work there for sure.
So
Yep.
speaking of predictions, perhaps we can do a whole show on this. We've got a mix in our audience, right? Some people who hold to CPT, others who hold to HPT. When it comes to hydroplate and Dr. Walt Brown, he made scientific future testable predictions. Fred, could you speak to a couple of those? Because again, the evolutionists challenge us. Oh, the gold standard of science is making future testable predictions. They have to be confirmed. But we've done that, haven't we, Fred?
Yeah, we have. And that's the beauty of the hydroplate theory, because, predictions are the true currency of good science. And Walt Brown made predictions in his book. You can find them in prior versions of his book. And then, later NASA proves his prediction, for example, finding that asteroids are floating rock piles. And that makes sense from the viewpoint that the fountains of the great deep, with all these rocks being hurled into space, that there's gonna be a lot of them gravitationally bound together. And so you have these rock piles floating through space. And NASA was shocked when they saw that, one of the asteroids they collided into, the Dartmouth mission, happened to be a floating rock pile. And then the other thing too, other predictions include like rounded boulders, because if you consider pebbles in a stream, and, because they're rubbing against each other. So over time, they become rounded. Well, NASA then discovers rounded boulders on some of these comets and asteroids. And like, what are these rounded boulders doing here? And the hydroplate theory explains that really well. There's many more. In fact, we plan on hopefully doing a kind of just a 20-minute to 30-minute overview of the hydroplate theory, because we've had some of our listeners asking about that. I mean, there's so many great videos out there. And I would encourage people to go watch Brian Nichols' series on the Hydroplate channel. It's a fantastic series. Just look up Brian Nichol Hydroplate and you'll find it easily. And we also have the hydroplate.org conference, where we have quite a few scientists that give presentations on it. I gave a presentation on modeling, and so I have serious issues with CPT modeling. And you can go watch my presentation on that. And Kevin Lee's got great stuff on the rocks in space and all the work he's done there. I love the fact that they found a rock on the moon, and then NASA reported this rock is similar to material to have coming from a watery environment 20 kilometers beneath the Earth's surface. I mean, that's right out of Walt Brown's
in
book.
space.
Basically,
in space, Fred.
They found it on the moon.
Wow.
And NASA said, oh yeah, this rock fits the material that's 20 kilometers beneath the Earth's surface in a watery environment. And so Alan Shepard either won the Earth Rock lottery, or else there's a lot of earth rocks on the moon, on the near side of the moon. Then there was this recent Chinese probe that in its analysis found that there's a lot more water on the near side of the moon than the far side. That was really interesting finding too. And that's current. That's like in the last month, I believe. There's so much. It's really cool. Bennu, the asteroid Bennu, they actually sent a probe up and landed on that thing, took back some samples, and found serpentinite. Well, you look up serpentinite, and guess where they find it? They find it at the mid-oceanic ridge, that big crack around the globe where the fountains of the great deep would have burst forth. It makes perfect sense that that's why that crack is there, and that's where the continent slid from the this big crack that went around the Earth that shot up all this water. And these sliding plates formed the mountains like Mount Everest. I had a guy on my channel recently saying, well, there's no way all the floodwaters could have covered Mount Everest. Well, Mount Everest wasn't that high up at the beginning of the flood. But there's so many predictions that he's made that have come true. Finding continental crust in the Pacific, and then they find Zealandia. There's so many really good evidences that make me I believe that the evidence strongly points to the hydroplate theory. I'm not going to say that every single argument that the hydroplate makes is correct. It's a very big theory. There's so much data, or there's so many parts of this theory. Brian Nichols' channel has 6 different videos on a lot of the different aspects. Like radioactivity, it's best explained by the hydroplate theory. Limestone, the formation of the limestone that has stumped geologists, secular geologists, forever. And the hydroplate theory has plausible explanations for all of this stuff.
according to the hydroplate theory, and I got so many questions for you on that. Such a fascinating. We'll have to do we're hoping to do a roundtable discussion in the summer, but also a separate program on hydroplate, going over the strengths of it and discussing it. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to limestone, because you're right, that's a major challenge, and that has dumbfounded a lot of secular geologists. Is from the hydroplate theory position, you've got the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open, and is that releasing a lot of the chemicals that would work towards rapidly forming limestone, or how does that work again, Fred?
I believe the limestone formation is in the subterranean waters, but see, this is where it's such a far encompassing theory. Guys like Brian Nickel would be able to speak to that better than I would. And I'm certainly not a geologist. I used to joke with Bob that, that's probably my least favorite topic is geology. He really loved rocks. And I love genetics, information science, of course, and which plays into genetics, biology, microbiology. So geology, I'm not super strong on. But from what I recall, the limestone is something that the chemical reactions are things that happen in the subterranean water. But don't quote me on that. I'd encourage people. Brian Nickel's series on that is just fantastic. It really is. It's easy to watch, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, we had the pleasure of interviewing back when we first started, going back 4 years ago, maybe now, maybe even 5. Time flies by when you're having fun. And we had the privilege of interviewing Bob Enyart and Brian Nickel on the program for about 3 hours. We discussed the heat problem for an hour. And that was a truly fantastic conversation. And so many years ago, but the information's still relevant today.
Yeah. 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 It'd be great if you get Brian on your channel again.
Yes.
For sure.
Anybody on your team, and you guys are doing great work over on your channel. One God is now here. $20 super chat. Appreciate the support. Says fantastic discussion with Fred. Fred, I could discuss this topic with you all day. We'll have to do another one of these, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely.
He says Real Science Radio has and is a valuable resource. Amen. I completely agree. You're putting out some excellent videos on your channel for Real Science. I also watched a video last night that I recommend with you and Dom, and you guys talked about all the science from the Bible. It's not that the Bible speaks a whole lot on science, but when it does, it's right. It hits the nail on the head. That's a fantastic program people need to watch.
Yeah, that's based off my website, BibleEvidences.com. So we used a lot of material from there. That site is from 1998.
Wow.
I used to have a lot of traffic, and then I made a mistake and switched to WordPress, and Google hated that and just wiped out my ranking. Or they could have done it for other nefarious reasons. But
well, let's help drive some traffic there. BibleEvidences.com. And evolutionfairytale.com, right?
Yes. Right. Yep.
Which is very true. Evolution is a fairy tale. I do want to address this comment before we close it down here for the night. I hope I didn't lose it. Somebody was questioning our point on, here it is, Sydney Raptor, one of our critics. Are you seriously denying that lactase persistence and tetrachromacy vision is a beneficial mutation? I think what we were demonstrating, Fred, and feel free to speak to this, that whether it's a true adaptation based on the pre-programmed ability to do so, epigenetics plays a part in that, or there's a deleterious or negative effect. The point is, these are not the kinds of mutations that are going to help, 1, take your fish to fishermen, 2, counterbalance the damage that's being done due to the rapid accumulation of so many slightly deleterious mutations. That was our point. But Fred, any thoughts on that?
Well, with the lactase persistence, they're assuming that that's beneficial. And yeah, I mean, I was talking to friends, hey, I love drinking my milk. Well, I don't want to say too much, but trust me, my wife is a very good witness and testimony that it was great when I figured out I was now lactose intolerant. So was it an advantage that I was I could drink milk, but at the same time had stomach problems? And maybe people who are not lactose intolerant, they may have stomach problems and don't know this because they're drinking milk, or they may have some other health problems. My son recently went on this diet where they restricted a lot of stuff. And it was just one of those cleansing diets for a month. And he noticed the effect, as he added things like of drinking milk. So I think it's a far cry to claim that lactase persistence is a beneficial mutation. That would be a hard case to make. And to your point, it would be so trivial anyways. I mean, is this all you have? And to tetrachromacy, that this is the first time I've heard of this, and it sounds like you've already looked into it and that there's other harmful things that come with it. But again, it could be something where the slightly harmful effects of having that, in addition to have the benefit, those slightly harmful effects could be a mutation from a prior mutation. So the information was already there. It'd be really hard to make, to me, a compelling case that that's a beneficial mutation.
Like you said, it could be a throwback to our Garden of Eden days where we could see more. In heaven, we'll probably be able to smell colors, hear colors. Right now, we can only see colors, right? So our senses.
Yeah, exactly. And then try to explain, well, then how does that help? So this tetrachromacy vision, how can you explain how that helped life evolve over time? If you think it was a new mutation and it wasn't some capability that possibly previously existed, how do you
Well, like you said earlier, the burden of proof is on them. They're the ones that believe bacteria-like organisms evolved into whales and humans and banana plants.
Yeah,
and the burden of proof is on them.
Yeah, and show me the genetic sequences that go back in time, and show me how show me the study that shows how far back they think, how many generations this goes back. When did this mutation occur? When did it become fixated? Apparently, it's not even fixated in the population. Not everybody has it, but
right, it's not.
it's just not a compelling argument for me, and I'm not even trying to be biased. I mean, I don't know, if I just came into this without a lot of knowledge, that would be. Boy, that could work either direction. It's hard to establish that as actually mutating something on the DNA that made it beneficial. And if it was that beneficial, why doesn't the whole human population have it? Where's the history of this thing?
Right.
So
we have a lot of history. Like with blue eyes, it's in a subpopulation. You were discussing, and I believe it was in your evidence for Young Earth Creation video, how all rare mutations, I'm assuming, have originated within the last 4,000 to 5,000 years. Which
that's it. You can't, when they look at the mitochondrial DNA and the mutations there. I don't know if you've heard of that one, where they they did an analysis and they came up with the mitochondrial eve of like 200,000 years, but they had very little data. And then all of a sudden they got all this data when they from the Romanowski family. I believe from the Russians, there was some data, a ton of data they got. And so when they reanalyzed the data, it turned out mitochondrial eve was a, quote, mere 6,000 years old. So they didn't like that. So Ann Gibbons, who wrote the article, said, well, that can't be the case. So what they ended up doing was they mixed in chimp DNA to get the ages back to 200,000 years. So they're assuming evolution is true. So they mix in chimp DNA to get the date back to 200,000 years. But when they look at just the data by itself, mitochondrial eve could have only been 6,000 years old. And that date sure sounds very familiar.
Yeah.
But Sydney, I appreciate the comments, and I hope you're continue searching for the truth, and you'll find it. It's Standing for Truth Ministries.
And Real Science Radio. You watch enough of us, you'll no longer believe you're related to strawberries and whales.
Yeah.
Or sponges. And you'll start having as much fun as we do.
I think we're like 70% similar to sponges, but I don't consider myself related to a sponge.
Right. Yeah. And, according to Richard Dawkins, that's some of the best evidence for evolution. There's a video out there, one fact to refute creationism. And he goes into all the DNA similarities on the planet between all your plants and animals and how they form nested hierarchical patterns. They can't see any other reason for those similarities. Fred?
Yeah. And then if you really look hard, like Sal Cordova has, you've got proteins that they have no common ancestor. None of the proteins in all the major families have any inkling of a common ancestor. In fact, You probably heard Aaron Ross he admitted they don't have any bleeping common ancestor.
Mhm.
Okay, well, then that refutes evolution. But to your point, he doesn't care. He hates God. And he's admitted that if God came and showed himself to him right now, he'd say, no, I don't accept you. I'm not going to worship you.
And that
It's
answers
bad.
his phylogeny challenge because we have separate ancestries with all those proteins. We got orphan genes. They
Mhm.
lack any consistent hierarchy. And one of my favorites, Fred, especially since 2024, they came out with the most sophisticated data analysis now of the great ape Y chromosomes. And when you compare the human Y and the chimp Y, and you consider overall architecture, gene content, and size differences, their Y chromosomes, which should be more stable, they lack recombination for the most part. Fred, I've heard you discuss that. They're less than 30% the same, brother. Less than 30. It was like 27, 28% now. There's
Yeah,
separate ancestry right there, too.
yeah. The scientists who reported on it said it was horrendous. So I'd
Yeah.
ask the audience, is horrendous? Is that a scientific term or an emotional worldview reaction term? Because it's horrendous because it goes against your worldview.
Right.
So yeah.
And like Richard Dawkins, these evolutionists, they like to point to the nested hierarchies. But yet when it comes to the Y chromosomes, you'd expect them to be more similar between humans and chimps, less messy. The human Y and the gorilla Y, they're more similar to each other than either are to the chimp Y. But according to the evolutionary theory, we split from a common ancestor with the chimp a shorter amount of time than with the gorilla. So what's going on there?
Yeah, it's too bad they're teaching all this stuff to kids in school and they just believe it. Kids go to college and they run into guys, like my daughter and my son. They find out, what, you don't believe in evolution? So that's what we're here for. We got to get more of the truth out, and hopefully social media and YouTube, we can reach more people. They can see this stuff and know that you've been brainwashed.
Yes,
And
because
just
they
consider
don't
the
hear.
evidence.
Unfortunately, they don't hear about these points, like what you said about the mitochondrial DNA. We've got mitochondrial DNA with low diversity. Any two people have just very few differences. You can trace back every single woman, like you said, to a single woman based on the known mutation rate, which is fast. And you do the same thing with the Y chromosome. Y chromosome mutates fast, and there's low variation in human male Y chromosomes. Those can be traced back to a single ancestor 4,500 years ago to Noah, Fred. I mean, we've literally discovered Adam and Eve, specifically Noah and Eve, in our genetics. Isn't that incredible?
Yeah. That is super cool. Yeah, and how we trace back to 3 major people groups, possibly 4, and that's secular science showing that, and it traces back to roughly around the time of the flood. So
That's
that
right.
fourth people group, I'd encourage people to go to rsr.org/Canaan and find out the story of the whole thing with Ham and this whole curse on Ham for uncovering his father's nakedness. There's an interesting story with all of that.
Yes, I want to read more on that, Fred, because I was watching one of your videos on that topic because I've done a lot of videos on the 3 major haplogroups, like you're referring to, L, M, and N,
Yeah.
which can be traced right back to Noah's 3 daughters-in-law. But you also got another haplogroup, R, and some have suggested, okay, that could be another daughter, right? And you made the point about Canaan, and I thought that is interesting. So I want to read up on that, brother.
Yeah, check it out. Again, rsr.org/Canaan. That was an insight by Bob Enyart, the late, great Bob Enyart. And I think it's very compelling. So the Bible tells us what it means when you see the nakedness of your father. That means you slept with his wife. And he unlocks that clue in different parts of Scripture. He who uncovers the nakedness of his uncle, it slept with his aunt. And so when when it says that Ham was cursed, or Canaan was cursed because of his father Ham, and Ham had seen his father's nakedness and his brothers went in to cover him, God had a polite way of saying that Ham had slept with his mother. And so now Canaan's going to have the mother and a grandmother as the same person.
Wow.
And he's going to get a bit made fun of. Just think of that. Nothing changes under the sun. So imagine that kid growing up with all the other kids of that time. Cursed as Canaan. It wasn't that God went and cursed Canaan, like, oh, you're cursed. it's Canaan is cursed because of this this sin that his father committed.
That is very interesting. And so that would give us two possible hypotheses where you have Noah's three daughters-in-law, or
and you have a blurred one. Like you said, there's kind of a blurred one. And so I don't know. I think the Bible, it's hard to get around. And I know some people don't agree with it, but I just think, I mean, the Bible's pretty clear that on that key that it gives, a certain key that unlocks what it means by saying slept with his, uncovered his father's nakedness. Because atheists love to grab on that and says, why would someone get cursed simply because they saw their father naked,
Right.
Well, guess what? There's a key to that. There's a hidden story that when you dig deeper, you'll uncover it. It's pretty cool. The Bible's so cool, isn't it, Donnie?
It is. It is. And the evidence in genetics, biology, chemistry, paleontology, talk about dinosaur soft tissue, collagen. And Dom made a good point when you guys were talking about that. If I remember correctly, he basically stated there's another piece of evidence for the legitimacy, Fred, of the Bible, because if these stories were fabricated, they would fabricate them in themselves in a good light. We're all heroes. We're great moral people. And yet we see story after story, like with Ham and Noah and possibly his mom, stories with Lot, still all kinds of Abraham, where we have imperfect people doing oftentimes very bad, wicked things, Fred.
Yep, absolutely. So, and Change Tan, who we're interviewing here, that show will be, I think, next week.
Nice.
She's a scientist from China, and her testimony is really interesting. And she talks about how, her going through the Bible and seeing, how, King David was a certain way. And it was interesting because hers was kind of a slightly different take. She got turned off by, wait, what, the God of the Bible, and there's these stories like this. So, but I encourage people to check that out. It was a really, really good interview with Dr. Tan.
Well, we'll definitely check that out. I've got her book and Dr. Rob Stadler's book, Stairway to Life, behind me.
Okay, great.
And that's an excellent book. I mean, that just demolishes any chance at abiogenesis being true. Sorry, Professor Dave.
Yeah. Dr. Stadler will be on our show, I believe, next month.
Awesome. So you've got some really exciting interviews then, Fred, lined up for us to look forward to.
Yeah. And likewise, Donnie, your content's been fantastic. I love it when your stuff shows up on my feed. And I missed the Bergman debate. I got to go check that out because he's a good debater.
Yes, you'll enjoy that one. He debated another PhD recently too, Dr. Chris Thompson. That was an excellent debate.
Okay. Wow.
And he'll be debating human evolution next month with Gutsick Gibbon, who's an anti-creationist on YouTube. So got some good debates to look forward to.
Oh, that's awesome.
Fred, well, I got to say, this has been a pleasure. Time has flown by. I loved your presentation. I really appreciated how up-to-date it was. You addressed so many important points, including chromosome 2 fusion, pseudogenes, gene duplication, nylon digestion. You really did demonstrate, Fred, that information science points to intelligent design and specifically the God of the Bible. So, Fred, appreciate your time. I appreciate what you do. Praise the Lord for what you do, you and your team. And I want to hand it to you, though, in case you had any final words, final thoughts, anything that you wanted to leave myself and our audience with tonight.
Well, just the truth of the Bible, and God, he is who he claims he is. Every time you sign a check or you log in and the date, it's a testimony to when Jesus came into this world as our Savior, came into the world to die for us and become human, to die, pay for our sins. It was a remarkable thing. I just hope, we want to bring about the fullness of the Gentiles. The more that we can save, the better. And please consider that. I know there's some skeptics watching this, and Jesus isn't the bad person that you've been led to believe by whatever it was in your high school, grade school, college, your friends who are negative. Just give him a chance, and you definitely won't regret it. So Again, thank you very much, Donny, and God bless.
Fred, God bless you. The perfect final words, an appeal to salvation. There's nothing more important than the question of eternity. Where will you spend eternity? And so I pray to those in the audience, if you're a believer, you're a fellow brother and sister, I pray that this was edifying, that this strengthened your faith, especially if you're a babe in Christ. And to our critics and skeptics, although we disagree, we do love when you guys are here to interact and engage with us, our points, and our presentations. Hopefully we've planted some seeds and we got you thinking some more about the origins question. Fred, God bless you. To the audience, God bless you all. We got several more shows this week, so we'll see you again soon in a couple days. And of course, thank you for tuning in. Hope you had as much fun as I did. Standing for Truth is out.